In the 1950s, the children of the Spodden Valley in Rochdale grew up believing they lived somewhere it snowed in summer. White dust settled on the hedges in July. It frosted the blackberries in late August and powdered the leaves of the woodland until the people who lived there gave the trees a name of their own. They called them the snow trees. It was beautiful. It was also asbestos, drifting down from the extractor fans of the largest asbestos factory the world had ever built. And the company that owned those fans already understood and would one day admit in its own private papers that the only truly safe amount of that dust to breathe was none at all. This is the story of how Britain's magic mineral poisoned an entire town. To understand how a single mineral could come to dust a whole valley white, you have to go back to a time when asbestos was not a word people feared. You have to go back to the cotton. Rochdale. In the 1870s was a Lancashire mill town, built on weaving, on soft water and steam, and the patient skill of turning fibre into cloth. In 1871, three brothers named Turner began spinning lubricated cotton into packing rings in a corner of their father's mill. They were ordinary men in an ordinary trade. Then around 1879, a London businessman named John Bell arrived with a sample of something strange. It had come from a Canadian mine, and it could be combed and spun like wool, yet it would not burn. The brothers fed it into their second-hand cotton machinery and discovered they could weave it into cloth. They became the first firm in Britain to power weave asbestos, and they renamed themselves Turner Brothers Asbestos. It must have felt like alchemy. Here was a stone you could turn into fabric, a fabric that laughed at fire. In an age of furnaces and boilers and ships and factories, a material that would not burn was close to miraculous. The trade name they gave one of their products was Firefly, and the name fits the mood of the era exactly. Something bright and weightless that seemed only to give light. The Turner family did not just sell asbestos, they became Rochdale. All three brothers served as aldermen and mayors of the town. One was knighted. The dynasty gave the town parks and gave a great organ to the town hall and endowed a dental school in Manchester. To work at Turner's was a respectable thing, a steady thing, a source of quiet civic pride. And that pride is important because it is the thing that would later make the betrayal so complete. You cannot betray someone who never trusted you. Rochdale trusted Turner's entirely. By the middle of the 20th century, the factory in the Spodden Valley had become the largest asbestos textile works on earth, spread across around 70 acres of the town. At its height, it employed something like 4,000 people, half of them on the factory floor and half in its offices. And it dominated the working life of Rochdale for more than a century. In a single year, it could turn out more than 2 million yards of asbestos cloth and 5.5 million miles of asbestos yarn. That is enough thread spun in 1 year to circle the entire planet more than 200 times. And the company looked after its own, or seemed to. There was a bowling green. There were Christmas parties for the workers' children. One man who spent more than 30 years there remembered it simply as a family thing, and said that people never really took on board what was being said about asbestos. Why would they? The dust was everywhere, and the dust was normal. Men swept it off the floors in drifts and spat it from their mouths and carried it home in the weave of their overalls, where their wives would shake it out and breathe it in over the washing. Outside the factory walls, where ordinary families lived, the air was measured at times to carry as many as 60 asbestos fibres in every cubic centimetre. The level the company itself regarded as safe was 2 or 3. That is the quiet horror underneath the bowling green and the Christmas parties. The frost on the blackberries was not a curiosity, it was a record, written in dust, of a town breathing something that would take 20, 30, 50 years to finish the job. We know now exactly how early the warnings began, and we know it because of one woman. Her name was Nellie Kershaw. She had left school at 12 to work in the mills, and by the age of 26 she was a rover at Turner Brothers, spinning raw asbestos into yarn. By 29 she could no longer breathe properly. By 31 she was certified unfit to work. And on the 14th of March 1924 she died. At the age of 33, her lungs scarred solid by the fibres she had spun for a living. In the months before she died, sick and without income, Nellie wrote to her employers asking for help. One of her letters survives. In it she says simply that she has been home for 9 weeks and has not received a penny, that she is needing nourishment and the money. The company refused her. It refused to pay her anything while she was alive, and when she died it refused even to contribute to her funeral, on the explicit grounds that to pay would, in their words, create a precedent and admit responsibility. When her doctor described her illness as asbestos poisoning, the company wrote back to repudiate the very phrase. Asbestos, they insisted, was not poisonous. Nellie Kershaw was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave in Rochdale Cemetery, where she lies unmarked to this day. But her death would not stay quiet. At the inquest, a pathologist examined her lungs and testified that the mineral particles he found in them had come from asbestos, and were, beyond reasonable doubt, the primary cause of the fibrosis of her lungs, and therefore of her death. 3 years later, the doctor who wrote up her case in the British Medical Journal gave the disease the name it still carries. He called it asbestosis. And so Rochdale gave the world two things at once. It gave the world the woven asbestos that would kill so many, and it gave the world the very word for the way they would die. Here is the part of the story that turns it from a tragedy into something colder, because what happened next was not ignorance, it was knowledge, carefully kept. As early as 1898, a government factory inspector had warned of the evil effects of asbestos dust and the sharp glass-like nature of its particles. In 1930, a report presented to Parliament found that around 2/3 of workers with 20 years in the trade had developed asbestosis. In 1937, a director of Turner and Newell, the great conglomerate the firm had by then become, wrote a sentence in an internal document that needs no interpretation at all. He wrote that all asbestos fibre dust is a danger to the lungs. That was 1937. The factory would keep producing for another 60 years. Then came the most damning chapter of all. In the early 1950s, the company hired a young researcher named Richard Dole, the man who would later prove to the world that smoking causes cancer, and asked him to study the records of its Rochdale workforce. The company expected to be reassured. Instead, in 1955, Dole found that heavily exposed long-term workers at the Rochdale factory were dying of lung cancer at something like 10 times the normal rate. He had proven, using the bodies of Rochdale's own people, that asbestos causes cancer. The company refused to let him publish. Dole and the editor of his journal went ahead and published anyway. And so Turner and Newell turned to one of its own scientists and had him draft a paper designed to discredit Dole's findings. It is worth being precise about what that means. The first hard proof that this dust caused cancer came out of Rochdale, out of Rochdale's own dead, and the company's response was not to protect the living, it was to attack the proof. Because it gets worse, and it gets more deliberate. In 1961, in its own internal papers, the company admitted the truth it would spend decades denying in public. It wrote that the only really safe number of asbestos fibres in the works environment was nil. Not a reduced number, not a carefully managed number, but none at all. The very thing it had told Nellie Kershaw's doctor was not poisonous, it now privately conceded had no safe dose whatsoever. And then, in 1968, it went a step further and built a machine to manage the lie. It circulated a confidential 5-point plan drawn up with the help of the international public relations firm Hill and Knowlton. the same kind of firm that had helped the tobacco industry. The plan was titled Putting the Case for Asbestos, and it began, in capital letters, with a single instruction to its staff: never be the first to raise the health question. One government medical advisor, consulted on what to do about the cancer risk, is recorded suggesting that the wisest course was to maintain complete secrecy. They understood the danger, they committed that understanding to paper, and then they chose, deliberately and in writing, to keep it to themselves. If you believe stories like this one deserve to be told honestly, the pride of a place set beside the true cost of it, then take a moment to subscribe, because that is the whole reason this channel exists. The cruelty of asbestos is that it is patient. The diseases it causes, and above all mesothelioma, the cancer of the lining of the lungs, can take 20, 30, even 50 years to surface. A man could breathe the dust as a young apprentice in the 1960s and feel perfectly well for half a century before it killed him, which means the true cost of those decades of silence did not arrive in the 1960s. It arrived later, slowly, like a debt coming due across whole lifetimes, and arrive it did. Britain now has one of the highest rates of mesothelioma in the world. In recent years, this single cancer has been killing around 2,500 people in Great Britain every year, roughly 10 times the number seen in the early 1970s, when the dust was still thick in the air. These are people dying now from exposures that happened a lifetime ago. The bill for the magic mineral is still being paid. In Rochdale, the dying spread far beyond the factory gates. It reached the wives who only ever washed the overalls. It reached the children. It reached people who never set foot inside the works and never drew a wage from it. People whose only mistake was to live downwind. There was a man named Derek Phillips who never worked at the factory at all. He simply lived a few yards from it for 19 years. He played bass in a band with men who did work there, and he died of mesothelioma, the factory's disease, without ever having been on its payroll. There is a strange and terrible twist in the numbers too. You might expect Rochdale to sit at the very top of Britain's tables of asbestos death. It does not, and the reason is its own quiet tragedy. The official figures are counted by where a person was living when they died, and the men who worked the Rochdale floor were a restless, mobile generation. Many of them moved away, emigrated to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, and died there, decades later. Their deaths recorded far from the valley that had killed them. Others died of asbestosis before the slower cancer could even take hold. So the true toll of Turner Brothers is scattered across the world, uncounted, falling quietly in other countries under other skies. The official number is not the truth. It is only the part of the truth that stayed home. On some streets near the factory, it was said, every second household had lost someone. You would think a reckoning would come for all this. It never quite did. For years, the company found friends in high places. Rochdale's own Member of Parliament, Cyril Smith, a man who held shares in Turner and Newell, wrote to the company in 1981, ahead of a parliamentary debate on asbestos, and asked them, in effect, to write his speech for him. The draft they sent him, and the speech he then delivered to the House of Commons, arguing for lighter regulation and insisting that the public at large were not at risk, were almost word for word the same. The company spied on the journalists investigating it. It sent someone undercover to a campaigners' meeting. It dismissed the television researchers exposing it as communists. This was not a firm defending an honest mistake. This was an organisation defending a secret. And when the secret finally became too expensive to defend, the company simply slipped away. With hundreds of thousands of injury claims piling up against it, Turner and Newell was bought by an American car parts giant, Federal Mogul, which set aside billions to cover the litigation, and then, in 2001, filed for bankruptcy protection in the United States. In Britain, the business went into administration that same year, leaving behind a pension fund hole estimated at £400 million. A compensation trust was eventually set up, but it pays only a small fraction of what each approved claim is actually worth. One solicitor described the hardest part of his job as having to tell dying people that, whatever else he might win them, he could not get them an apology. There would be no apology. There was barely even a ban. Britain did not finally outlaw all forms of asbestos until the 24th of November, 1999. 75 years after Nellie Kershaw died in an unmarked grave in Rochdale, the country at last made the thing that killed her illegal. So what is left, in the end, of the largest asbestos factory the world ever built? The answer is the most haunting part of the whole story. The factory closed in the 1990s, and the great site in the Spodden Valley fell silent. In 2004, it was sold to developers who proposed an urban village on the land, 650 homes, a children's daycare centre, a business park. Their planning application made a remarkable claim. It noted, of particular interest, the absence of any asbestos contamination. This, on the site of the largest asbestos works on the planet, where the fibres were visible on the ground, where testing would find asbestos wrapped around the very roots of the trees, where it is believed that blue asbestos, the deadliest kind, had for years been dumped and buried and capped across the land. A local councillor, himself a former Turner's man, gave the place the name it has carried ever since. He called it Rochdale's Chernobyl. The homes were never built, they were refused. And so 2 decades on, the site sits there still, fenced and derelict and too poisoned to safely touch, a wound in the middle of a living town that no one has yet found a way to heal. When the air around it was monitored over 18 months, only a single stray fibre was found, and the official conclusion was that there was no significant risk. A campaigner who has fought for that valley for years answered the only way the absurdity allowed. The findings, he said, would have you believe that the air above the world's largest asbestos factory is now some of the cleanest on Earth. In the town's memorial gardens, thousands of white and purple crocuses have been planted to bloom each year for the people asbestos killed. It is a gentle thing, and a good one, but it is worth remembering what the snow trees taught the children of the Spodden Valley all those summers ago. That something can fall softly and beautifully and still be the thing that is killing you. Rochdale was promised warmth, a mineral that would never burn. What it got was a frost that has never melted. The company is gone. Most of the men who breathed the dust are gone. The verdict, such as it was, has come and faded. And still the poison waits in the ground. And still, in a quiet corner of Rochdale Cemetery, the first of all its victims lies in a grave with no name on it at all. If this is the kind of history you think deserves to be remembered properly, the rise and the reckoning told together, then subscribe and stay with this channel. There are other towns and other silences, and they are worth your time.